brain is always active. Now, when you're in dreaming sleep, some parts of the brain are much less active than they are during the waking state. And in particular, frontal structures, which are active, especially when you're awake and carrying out decisions. It's very active then, but it's interesting that during the dreaming state, that part is less active. Now, we don't know exactly what that means, but it seems to have something to do with the sort of chaotic nature of dreams, and that there is no sort of real coherence to many dreams, that crazy things happen, and long dead grandfathers appear and we're not surprised. And it all seems to point to this lower level of activity of frontal structures during the dreaming state. Well, it's not well understood. And much of the brain is still active. Particular parts of the brain stem change their patterns of activity during deep sleep. And this has an effect on a set of structures inside a deep structure called the thalamus. And so we know there are changes in the thalamus when we fall asleep, so that we're really not aware either of ourselves or of outside stimuli. But then that changes slightly again when we go into dreaming sleep. And there are many different stages of sleep during the night. And the dreaming stages get longer and longer as morning approaches. And the deep sleep stages are longer in the early parts of the night, which is why you often wake up, from a dream at about, 7 o'clock and think, oh, I'm glad I've woken up from that. And you have almost certainly no idea, no recollection whatever of the dreams that you had around midnight. I think there are many fundamental things that we do not understand about how the brain is organized and how it achieves things like the coherence that we were talking about. It's just not understood. The brain builds a model, at least very complex brains do. They build a model of the outside world. And they structure that model according to spatial relations, and according to objects that are in that space. And so even when you turn your head away from me and no longer see me, when you turn back, you don't think it's a wholly new person that just happened to look like me. You think it's the same thing. That's a construction that's part of the brain's model of organizing this external world. And all nervous systems are in that business. And we think that nervous systems of mammals, especially of primates, are probably just a lot richer in the models they create of the physical world, but also of the social world. So, in some ways your question is a very deep question, because if you want to ask me, so what's really the nature of the physical world? The answer is that we find out through science. So we take something that we think we understand, and then we probe a little deeper and we think, oh, I don't understand that at all. And this happened, for example, with fire. People thought they understood fire, and then somebody said, but what is it really? And how can fire have this capacity to change a stick of wood into ash? And it's always when scientists ask these deeper questions about the reality behind the appearances that we come to understand things like the universe is made up of atoms. And atoms are structured with electrons and protons and neutrons and so forth. But to be sure, it doesn't look like that. Right? Science had to work at it for a long time before we understood, yeah, that's probably true. And of course, radio waves and light waves were around for a long time before people really knew what that is. Many people thought that light is a fundamental feature of the universe, never explainable in terms of anything else. By the end of the 19th century, Clerk Maxwell in England realized that visible light and X-rays and radio waves, all part of the same spectrum, and that we can describe the physical properties of all of those waves. Moreover, we can explain why we only see light waves and not radio waves or X-rays. And the answer has to do with the way our retina is structured. Now, other animals can see more. For example, bees can see in the ultraviolet range. And so they can see things that we cannot. And ultraviolet is sort of at the far end of the spectrum that we think of as visible light. They just happen to have receptors that are sensitive to that. And similarly, with regard to temperature, or with regard to heat, rattlesnakes have the capacity at a distance to be sensitive to something warm in the environment. You and I don't have that. If I'm wondering whether you're warm, I've got to go up and touch you. But a rattlesnake who hunts at night for warm-blooded things like mice has a sensor, and it's sensitive to infrared. So there's bees sensitive to ultraviolet, there are mice sensitive to infrared, and we're in here. But we do have more than 6 senses. So we have vision, the auditory system, smell, taste, and touch. But there's many systems of touch. I mean, you know, you can touch, you can feel light touch, you can feel pressure. Different neurons do that. You can feel many different kinds of pain. Different neurons do that. But a sense that you could not possibly do without being a complete and total wreck, is a sense you take for granted. Positional sense. It's the vestibular system in your semicircular canals in your middle ear. And that tells you, is your head moving? Are you falling? Are you standing up? Are you accelerating? Are you decelerating? People who have a disease that impairs their sense of balance, impairs their vestibular system, are just totally dysfunctional. They can't walk, they can't get up, they can't maintain posture, and it's one of the worst kinds of nervous system disorders that there is. And that, if you like, is our 6th sense. Oh, I think, no. I mean, I think there's many things I'd like to know. I'd like to know how information is integrated across the senses. I'd like to understand in greater detail how certain things become conscious and other things don't. I'd like to understand how decisions are made, because it's quite clear that it's not by a little deductive syllogism, but by a whole lot of different elements converging and somehow interacting, and a decision gets made. There is preliminary work on all of those issues, and those are the ones that preoccupy me. Although clinically, the thing I would very much like to understand is schizophrenia. Because as you probably know, schizophrenia worldwide affects about 1% of the population. So 1 in 100 people will have it. And it can be totally debilitating. It deprives people of a normal life, of the capacity to hold a job, of the capacity to think clearly, to have normal emotional responses. And so far, the genetic research has not yielded very clear information about the genes. And so we're pretty sure that there is a genetic element, but every time a piece of research focuses on a family with high incidence of schizophrenia and finds an association between the schizophrenics and a gene, and they put it on that chromosome, somebody else has one there, and one there, and one there. And so at this point in genetic research, all 23 chromosomes have these marks on them that link genes with schizophrenia. And that basically tells us we really don't know what's going on. A little bit of research has revealed some of that. One of the things is that events that are very meaningful to us are events that we're more apt to remember. Events that are very terrible or events that are particularly pleasurable may also be events that we remember. But we think that the brain is very clever about all this, that it can't store everything. The brain's not big enough. So it has to be very selective about what it remembers. And in fact, people who can't forget have a terrible handicap because they just can't sort through all this junk. So the brain has to be very clever in what it stores and what it forgets. And forgetting is extremely essential. And we understand at a behavioral level a little bit about the selection process. Neurobiologically, it's still under study.